Hi boys and girls, I'm going to continue to read Charlotte's Web, but before I begin with a new chapter, let's just refresh our memories so we know what we read from last week. We know it's summertime and school has left out. Fern is spending a lot of time at the barn. Something wonderful happened. There were 7 goslings that were born. Now we knew that they started out with 8 eggs. The one was a dud. So the goose and the gander had given that to Templeton. But everybody was very suspicious of Templeton because he was sneaky, and they said you couldn't trust him. So Templeton was happy to take the egg and he rolled it under Wilbur's trough. And then poor Wilbur had some bad news. The old sheep had told him that at Christmas time they were going to kill him. Well, Wilbur of course cried and carried on. But Charlotte told him, now calm down, it's okay. She said, I'm going to save you, Wilbur. Even though she wasn't quite sure how. But she did tell him, I promise I will save you. And in chapter 8, Fern was talking with her mom. And her mom's a little bit worried about Fern because she spends so much time at the farm. And her mom's also concerned because Fern is talking to the animals. And that's where we left off. So picking up today, this is chapter 9, and it's called Wilbur's Boast. A spider's web is stronger than it looks. Although it is made of thin, delicate strands, the web is not easily broken. However, a web can get torn every day by the insects that kick around in it, and a spider must rebuild it when it gets full of holes. Charlotte liked to do her weaving during the late afternoon, and Fern liked to sit by and watch. One afternoon, she heard the most interesting conversation. Wilbur said, "You have awfully hairy legs, Charlotte." She said, "My legs are hairy for a reason. And furthermore, each leg of mine has 7 sections." Wilbur sat upright. "You're kidding me." She said, "No, I'm not kidding." "My goodness," said Wilbur, and he looked down at his own chubby legs. "I don't think my legs have 7 sections." "Well," said Charlotte, "you and I lead different lives. You don't have to spin a web, and that takes real leg work." "I could spin a web if I tried," said Wilbur. "I've just never tried." "Let's see you do it," said Charlotte. And Fern chuckled softly. "Okay," said Wilbur, "I can do it. You coach me and I'll spin a web. It must be a lot of fun to spin a web. How do I start?" Charlotte was smiling and she said, "Take a deep breath." So Wilbur did. Then she said, "Now climb to the highest place that you can get to, like this." And Charlotte raced to the very top of the doorway. So Wilbur scrambled up to the top of his manure pile. "All right, very good," she said. "Now take an attachment with your spinnerets and hurl yourself into space and let out a drag line as you go down." Wilbur hesitated for a moment. Then he jumped out into the air. He glanced behind him to see if there was a piece of rope following him, and he wanted to check his fall. But nothing seemed to be happening in his rear, and the next thing he knew, he landed in a thump. "Oop!" "Ugh," he grunted. Charlotte laughed so hard that the web began to sway. "What did I do wrong, Charlotte?" "Nothing," she said. "That was a nice try." "I think I'll try again," he said cheerfully. "I believe that what I need is a little piece of string to hold me." So Wilbur walked out into the yard. He said, "Hey, Templeton, are you out there?" And the rat poked his head up from underneath the trough. "You got a little piece of string I could borrow?" he asked. "I need to spin a web." "Well, yes, indeed I do," replied Templeton. "No trouble at all. Anything to oblige." So he crept back down into his hole, pushed the goose egg out of his way, and returned with an old piece of dirty white string. And Wilbur examined it. He said, "That's just the thing. Thank you, Templeton. Now come here, please. Tie one end of this string to my tail, will you?" Wilbur crouched down low with his thin curly tail towards the rat. Templeton grabbed the string, passed it around the end of the pig's tail, and tied 2 little knots. Charlotte watched in delight. Like Fern, who was truly fond of Wilbur, whose smelly pen and stale food attracted the flies that she needed, and she was proud to see that he was not a quitter and he was willing to try again and again to spin a web. While the rat and the spider and the little girl watched, Wilbur climbed back up to the top of the manure pile. He was full of energy and hope this time. He said, "Everybody watch!" And summoning all of his strength, he threw himself back up into the air, head first. The string trailed behind him. But as he had neglected to fasten the other end to anything, it didn't do any good, and Wilbur landed with a thud, crashed, and hurt. Tears came to his eyes. Templeton grinned. Charlotte just sat quietly. After a bit, she spoke. Let me show you the pictures. "You can't spin a web, Wilbur, and I advise you to put the idea out of your mind. You lack 2 things that you need for spinning a web." "What are they?" Wilbur asked sadly. "You lack a set of spinnerets, and you lack the know-how. But cheer up, you don't need to spin a web. Zuckerman supplies you with 3 big meals a day. Why should you worry about trapping food?" Wilbur sighed. "You're ever so much cleverer and brighter than I am, Charlotte. I guess I was just trying to show off. It serves me right." Templeton untied his string and took it back to his home, and Charlotte returned to her weaving. "You needn't feel badly, Wilbur," she said. "Not many creatures can spin webs. Even men aren't as good as spiders, although they think they're pretty good, and they'll try anything. Did you ever hear of the Queensboro Bridge?" Wilbur shook his head. "Is it a web?" "Well, sort of," she replied. "But do you know how long it took men to build this bridge? 8 whole years. My goodness, I would have starved to death waiting that long. I can make a web in 1 single evening." "Well, what do people catch on this bridge? Bugs?" he asked. No, said Charlotte. "They don't catch anything. They just keep driving back and forth the bridge, thinking there's something better on the other side or something better on this side. If they'd hang head down at the top of the thing and wait quietly, maybe something good would come along. But no, with men it's rush, 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 every minute. I'm glad that I'm a sedentary spider." "What does sedentary mean?" asked Wilbur. "It means I sit a good part of the time and don't go wandering all over creation. I know a good thing when I have it, and my web is a good thing. I stay put and I wait for things to come. It gives me a chance to think." "Well, I'm sort of sedentary myself," said Wilbur. "I have to hang around here whether I want to or not. You know where I'd really like to go this evening?" Charlotte said, "No, where would you like to go?" "I'd like to go in a forest looking for beech nuts and truffles and just searching and sniffing along the ground and smelling and smelling and smelling." "You smell just the way you are," remarked a lamb who had just walked in. "I can smell you from here. You're the smelliest creature in this place, Wilbur." Oh, Wilbur hung his head. His eyes grew wet with tears. Charlotte noticed his embarrassment, and she spoke sharply to the lamb. She said, "Let Wilbur alone. He has a perfect right to smell, considering his surroundings. You're no bundle of sweet peas yourself. Furthermore, you are interrupting a very pleasant conversation." Now, what were we talking about, Wilbur, when we were so rudely interrupted? "Oh, I don't remember," said Wilbur. "It doesn't make any difference. Let's not talk any more for a while, Charlotte. I'm getting sleepy. You go ahead and finish fixing your web, and I'll just lie here and watch you. It's a lovely evening." And Wilbur stretched out on his side. Twilight settled in over Zuckerman's barn, and a feeling of peace. Fern knew it was almost supper time, but she couldn't bear to leave. Lurvy sat down under an apple tree and lit his pipe. The animals sniffed the familiar smell of strong tobacco. Wilbur heard the trill of the tree toad and occasional slamming of the kitchen door. All these sounds made him feel comfortable and happy, for he loved his life and loved to be a part of the world on a summer evening. But as he lay there, he remembered what the old sheep had told him. The thought of death came to him, and he began to tremble with fear. "Charlotte?" he said softly. "Yes, Wilbur?" "I don't want to die." "Of course you don't," she said. "I just love it here in the barn. I love everything about this place," he said. "Of course you do," said Charlotte. "We all do." The goose then appeared, followed by her 7 goslings. They thrust their little necks out and kept up a musical whistling. Wilbur listened to the sound with love in his heart. "Charlotte?" he said. "Yes?" said the spider. "Were you serious when you promised you would keep them from killing me?" "I was never more serious in my life. I am not going to let you die, Wilbur." "How are you going to save me?" he asked. "Well," Charlotte said vaguely, "I really don't know, but I'm working on a plan." "That's wonderful," said Wilbur. "How is the plan coming, Charlotte? Have you got far with it? Is it coming along? Is it coming along pretty well?" Wilbur was trembling again, but Charlotte was cool and collected. She said very calmly, "Oh, it's coming all right. The plan is still in its early stages and hasn't been completely shaped up yet, but I'm working on it. Don't worry." "When do you work on it?" begged Wilbur. She said, "Oh, when I'm hanging upside down at the top of my web. That's when I do my best thinking, because then all the blood rushes to my head." "I'd be glad to help in any way I can." "Oh, I'll work on it alone," she said. "I can think better when I'm alone." "All right," said Wilbur, "but don't fail to let me know if there's anything I can do to help, no matter how slight. I would love to help." "Well," replied Charlotte, "you must try to build yourself up. I want you to get plenty of sleep and stop worrying. Never hurry and never worry. Chew your food thoroughly and let every bit in, except you must leave a little bit for Templeton. I want you to gain weight and stay well. That's the way that you can help. I want you to keep fit and don't lose your nerve. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand," said Wilbur. "All right," she said. "Go along to bed then. Sleep is very important." Wilbur trotted over to the darkest corner of his pen and threw himself down. He closed his eyes, and then in another minute he spoke. "Charlotte?" "Yes, Wilbur." "May I go out to my trough and see if I left anything from my supper? I think I left a tiny bit of mashed potatoes." Charlotte said, "Very well, but I want you back in bed without delay." Wilbur started to race out of the yard. "Slowly, slowly," said Charlotte. "Never hurry and never worry." Wilbur checked himself and crept slowly to his trough. He found a bit of a potato, chewed it carefully, swallowed it, and walked back to bed. He closed his eyes and was silent for a while. "Charlotte?" he whispered. "Yes?" "May I get a drink of milk? I think there's a few drops left in my trough." "No, the trough is dry, and I want you to go to sleep. No more talking, Wilbur. Close your eyes and go to sleep," she said. Wilbur shut his eyes. Fern got up from her stool and started for home. Her mind was full of everything she had seen and heard. "Good night, Charlotte," said Wilbur. "Good night, Wilbur." Then there was a pause. "Good night, Charlotte." "Good night, Wilbur." "Good night." "Good night." And that was the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 is called An Explosion. And let me show you the picture of Charlotte as she's weaving her web. Alrighty, an explosion. Day after day, the spider waited, head down, for an idea to come to her. Hour by hour, she sat motionless, deep in thought. Having promised Wilbur that she would save his life, she was determined to keep her promise. Charlotte was naturally patient. She knew from experience that if she waited long enough, a fly would come into her web. And she felt sure that if she thought long enough about Wilbur's problem, an idea would come into her mind. Finally, one morning toward the middle of July, an idea came to her. "Why, how perfectly simple," she said to herself. "The way to save Wilbur's life is to play a trick on Zuckerman. If I can fool a bug," she thought, "I can surely fool a man. People are not as smart as bugs." Wilbur walked into his yard just at that moment, and he asked, "What are you thinking about, Charlotte?" She said, "I was thinking that people are very gullible." "Gullible? What does that mean?" he asked. She said, "It means that they're easy to fool." "That's a mercy," replied Wilbur, and he lay down in the shade of his fence and went fast asleep. The spider, however, stayed wide awake, gazing affectionately at him and making plans for his future. Summer was half gone. She knew she didn't have much time. That morning, just as Wilbur fell asleep, Avery Arable wandered into the Zuckerman's front yard, followed by Fern. Avery carried a live frog in his hand. Fern had a crown of daisies in her hair, and the children ran in to the kitchen. Mrs. Zuckerman said, "Just in time for a piece of blueberry pie." Avery said, "Look at my frog!" Mrs. Zuckerman hollered, "Take that thing out of here!" "He's hot," said Fern. "He's almost dead, that frog." "He is not," said Avery. "He lets me scratch him between the eyes." And then the frog jumped out of his hand and into Mrs. Zuckerman's dishpan. "You're getting your pie on you," said Fern. "Can I look for eggs in the hen house, Aunt Edith?" Mrs. Zuckerman said, "Run outdoors, both of you, and don't bother the hens." "It's getting all over everything," shouted Fern. "His pie is all over his front." Avery said, "Come on, frog," and he scooped up the frog. The frog kicked and splashed soapy water all over the blueberry pie. "Oh, another crisis," groaned Fern. Avery said, "Hey, let's go swing on the swing." And the children ran to the barn. Mr. Zuckerman had the best swing in the county. It was a single long piece of heavy rope tied to the beam on the north doorway. At the bottom end of the rope was a fat knot to sit on. It was arranged so that you could swing without being pushed. You climbed a ladder up to the hayloft. Then, holding on to the rope, you stood at the edge, looked down, and were scared and dizzy. Then you straddled the knot so that it was acting like a seat. Then when you got up all of your nerve, you took a deep breath and you jumped. For a second, you seemed to be falling to the barn floor far below, but suddenly the rope would catch you and you would sail through the barn door going a mile a minute, and the wind would be whistling in your eyes and ears and hair. Then you would zoom up towards the sky and look up at the clouds, and the rope would twist you and turn you. Then you would drop down, down, down out of the sky and come sailing back in through the barn again. Up and back and up and back, then in and out and in and out. And then you'd jump off and fall down and let somebody else give it a try. Mothers for miles around worried about Zuckerman's swing. They feared some child would fall off, but no child ever did. Avery put the frog in his pocket and climbed back up the hayloft. "Take that frog out," ordered Fern. Avery straddled the rope and jumped. He sailed out through the door, frog and all, out into the sky, frog and all. Then he sailed back into the barn. Here's a picture. Fern screamed, "Your tongue is purple." "So is yours," said Avery. "I have hay inside my dress and it itches," said Fern. "Scratch it," yelled Avery. Fern said, "It's my turn. Jump off." "Fern's got the itch. Fern's got the itch," sang Avery. When he jumped off, he threw the swing up to his sister. She shut her eyes tight and jumped. She felt the dizzy drop, then the supporting lift of the swing. When she opened her eyes, she was looking out into the bright blue sky. She flew back and forth. They took turns doing this for at least an hour. When the children grew tired of swinging, they went down toward the pasture and picked wild raspberries and ate them. Their tongues turned purple, from purple to red. Avery found an empty candy box and put his frog in it. The frog seemed tired after his morning in the swing. Then the children walked slowly up toward the barn. They too were tired and hardly had enough energy to walk. Avery then suggested, "Let's build a tree house. I want to live in a tree house with my frog." Fern said, "I'm going to visit Wilbur." They climbed the fence into the lane and walked toward the pig pen. Wilbur heard them coming and got up. Avery then noticed the spider web, and coming closer to it, he saw Charlotte. He said, "Hey, look at that big spider. It's tremendous." "Leave it alone," yelled Fern. "You've got a frog, isn't that enough?" He said, "That's a fine spider and I'm going to capture it." He took the cover off of the candy box. Then he picked up a stick. "I'm going to knock that old spider off and land it in my box." Wilbur's heart almost stopped when he saw what was going on. This might be the end of Charlotte if the boy succeeded in catching her. "You stop it, Avery!" cried Fern. Avery put one leg over the fence of the pig pen. He was just about to raise his stick to hit Charlotte when he lost his balance. He swayed and toppled and landed on the edge of Wilbur's trough. The trough tipped up and then finally came down with a slap. The goose egg was right underneath. There was a dull explosion as the egg broke, and then a horrible smell. Yuck. Fern screamed. Avery jumped to his feet. The air was full of a terrible gas and the smells from the rotten egg. Yuck! Templeton, who had been resting in his home, scuttled away into the barn. "Ugh, good night," screamed Avery. "Good night, what a stink. Let's get out of here." Fern was crying. She held her nose and ran toward the house. Avery ran after her, holding his nose. Oh, Charlotte felt greatly relieved to see him go. It had been a narrow escape. Later on that morning, the animals came up from the pasture. The sheep, the lamb, the gander, the goose, and the 7 goslings. There were many complaints about the awful smell, and Wilbur had to tell the story over and over again of how the arable boy had tried to capture Charlotte and how the smell of the broken egg drove him away just in time. "It was that rotten goose egg that saved Charlotte's life," said Wilbur. The goose was proud to have her share in the adventure. She said, "I'm delighted that egg never hatched." Templeton, of course, was miserable over the loss of his beloved egg. But he couldn't resist boasting. He said it pays to save things. A rat never knows when something is going to come in handy. I never throw anything away. "Well," said one of the lambs, "this whole business is all well and good for Charlotte, but what about the rest of us? This smell is unbearable. Who wants to live in a barn that smells like a rotten egg?" "Don't worry, you'll get used to it," said Templeton. He sat up and pulled wisely at his long whiskers. Then he crept away to pay a visit to the dump. When Lurvy showed up at lunchtime carrying a pail of food for Wilbur, he stopped short from the pig pen. He sniffed the air and made a face. "What in thunder?" he said. Setting the pail down, he picked up the stick that Avery had dropped and pried it to lift up the trough. "Phew," he said. "Rats. I might have known a rat would make a nest under his trough. Ugh, how I hate a rat," he said. And Lurvy dragged Wilbur's trough across the yard and kicked some dirt into the rat's nest, bearing the broken egg and all of Templeton's other possessions. Then he picked up the pail. Wilbur stood in the trough, drooling with hunger. Lurvy poured. The slops ran creamily all the way down the pig's eyes and face and through his ears. Wilbur grunted. He gulped and slurped and gulped and slurped, making swishing and swooshing noises, anxious to get everything at once. It was a delicious meal. It was skim milk, wheat middlings, leftover pancakes, half of a donut, 2 pieces of stale toast, a fish tail, an orange peel, several noodles from some noodle soup, a little bit of cocoa, an ancient jelly roll, a strip of paper from the lining of the garbage can, and a spoonful of raspberry jello. Wilbur ate heartily. He planned to leave half a noodle and a few drops of milk for Templeton. Then he remembered that the rat had been useful in saving Charlotte's life, and that Charlotte was trying to save his life. So he left a whole noodle for Templeton. Now that the broken egg was buried, the air cleared and the barn smelled good again. The afternoon passed and the evening came. Charlotte sat eating a horsefly in her web and thinking about the future. She came down to the center of the web, and there she began to cut off some of her lines. She worked slowly but steadily while the other creatures started to drowse. None of the others, not even the goose, noticed that she was at work. Deep in his soft bed, Wilbur snoozed. Over in their favorite corner, the goslings were whistling a tune. Charlotte tore quite a section out of her web, leaving an open space right in the middle. Then she started weaving something to take the place of the threads that she had already torn out. When Templeton got back from the dump, around midnight, the spider was still at work. And that's the end of chapter 10.